Good morning. This is Faith in Our Hometown, brought to you as a community service and sponsored by Mercy Hospital, Joplin. And now, here's your host, Father Jay Friedel.
Good morning. I hope you're having a great Sunday, and welcome back to Faith in Our Hometown, our weekly discussion about things that we hope matter to us as people of faith of the greater Joplin area. My guests this morning are going to be guests from a few weeks ago. We had a wonderful conversation with Dr. Paul Tevereau and Dr. Jim Jackson, both retired from Missouri Southern, but we were talking about faith and reason, and we really just started into the conversation and just scratched the surface when we were completely out of time. So I invited them both back for Faith and Reason Part 2. And so we're going to kind of pick up where we left off. I'll give a little introduction to that right when we come back. But we're going to take a moment and break for a Mercy Minute. And we are going to be right back after that. And when we come back, we're going to be discussing, can a person be a person of faith and a person of reason? Are those two somehow in conflict with one another? We're going to answer that question and hopefully a whole lot more fun when we come back right after this Mercy Minute.
Once I quit playing football, I still kept up with the eating, the amount of calories I wasn't exercising, so the weight started adding on. Dr. Lou is very knowledgeable in the work he does. He also has a program set up that has support systems in place for you. You'll go through the seminar at first. He'll give you the different examples of surgeries you can have to see which one works best with you. He will also sit down with you and discuss the options, what he feels, but he'll work with you the entire time. Mercy has their gastric bypass program here. They have all kinds of resources and support systems in place. They want to see you succeed, and they're here to help you the entire time, even after the surgery.
So again, thanks for joining us this morning. My guests, Dr. Paul Tevereau, Dr. Jim Jackson, both retired. Jim is a retired biology professor at Southern. Paul, a retired history professor, right?
Correct.
And so last time we were just talking about how can you be a person of learning and a person of faith all at the same time. And just again, a quick synopsis. Paul is a member of the United Hebrew Congregation here, and Jim, unfortunately, is a member of St. Peter's Roman Catholic Church downtown and has to put up with me. So apologies and
it's all right.
Blessings to
we
you,
put
my
up
friend.
with you.
Exactly. So that was kind of where we left off because we just got started talking about the last time. So how can I be a person of, for example, science and still be a person of faith? How does that work?
Well, actually, there are some hard parts. The nice thing about the research that I did in science, it was actually grassland restoration and botanically oriented, and there was a distance from it, and I could look at the possible survival of native prairie species of native prairies, but it really didn't affect me directly. And then especially Pope Francis called for a new integrated look at ecology as also it is our responsibility, and he pointed out directly of our responsibility as individuals that we caused the environmental problems that we're in, and we are to do something about it. And then also that it includes the poor more seriously than us. And it was a whole change of looking at it. I was comfortable with science before because I was distanced from it, and I could speculate on the survival of bladder pod on Wilson's Creek National Monument, and it wasn't affecting me directly. But now, with the way that the Pope had me look at it, I realized that it is urgent that we deal with the people who are affected by the ecological changes, and we're responsible for it. And it changed my outlook on things,
Yeah. So really, being a man of science has caused you to be more of a person, or being a man to be more of a person of faith.
Oh, it has. I was more comfortable in science than I was in faith.
Well, I don't think we ever should become too comfortable in faith. Now,
Well,
that's just my own personal
yeah.
thing there, but I don't
That's
think
probably
we should
true.
ever become too comfortable in faith, because being a little uncomfortable from time to time and seeing the challenges that are involved in it are really kind of important.
Yeah.
Paul, how about for yourself in terms of did your discipline as an historian ever come up against or challenge you as a person of faith?
Well, as Jim can tell you, I can answer that in two ways. In some ways, yes, clearly it challenges my faith, my beliefs as a Jew. Important parts of the Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament, are not and probably can never be corroborated,
Right.
such as the existence of a man named Abraham, let alone whether God made a covenant with him, the Exodus from Egypt, the location of Mount Sinai, wherever that occurred. So they're important, considering that, as I mentioned in the last show, Judaism is a religion based on history that has an intimate relationship with history. A lot of the history isn't corroborated in the same way that historians expected. At the same time, I'd have to say that some parts of the biblical narrative have been corroborated by history, such as, for example, the term Hebrew, originally applied to Abram. We know from Egyptian sources from the 1400s that there were a Northwest Semitic people called Kabiru who were entering there. The very word Israel, used to describe this people later on, again an Egyptian source from the 1200s, mentions Israel. And there's archaeological evidence that confirms, for example, the infrastructure work going on in Jerusalem during the reign of Hezekiah in the 600s. And in fact, there's Assyrian records that take a very different slant on the Assyrian siege of Jerusalem in the 600s, but nevertheless are in substantial agreement with the biblical account. So whereas I would say respectfully, for religion and science, at some point you have to realize we're dealing with really two different areas of the human experience.
Yeah.
For history and the Jewish Bible, not entirely so.
Right, and I think that and again, now this is me coming as a theologian. Okay, when I look at scriptural record, I don't look at it to be the same kind of historical record that somebody today who would be trying to chronicle something would do that. I think that when I look at a biblical record, like for example, I don't think that for example the Gospels for Jesus were videotaped at 6. Like this is being videotaped, or not even videotaped, but it's digitally being recorded. See, I'm already a dinosaur. But when we look at those things and see those things, I think that that the biblical record was not supposed to be videotaped at 6. It was supposed to be a faith story, explaining faith to a people rather than a science textbook or rather than a history textbook per se.
That's exactly right, Jay, and I think you put it very well, because when I talk to non-Jewish groups, I try to explain our Torah, the other parts of our Bible. It has a lot of history, but it's not meant to be a history book. It has a lot of law,
Right.
but it's not primarily legal code. Both the history and the law are supposed to, in each in its own way, testify to the covenant with God. That's supposed to be the basis of our religion.
And I'm going to say, and I know there are a lot of folks, perhaps watching, who do take more a biblical, a literal interpretation of the scriptures than I would take, either personally or, at least in our terms of our denomination, the way we would look at things. And again, I'm certainly not, please don't anyone feel like I'm picking at your way of interpreting. I just know that in my way of interpreting, we don't take a literal interpretation. We take a contextual interpretation of what that means. And so we take the historical, what we can know about the historical setting into context, but we don't try to necessarily lock it into that and say that these words, whenever we look at what the words say, we've got to look at what it meant in terms of the broader understanding of how that all fits, rather than saying, okay, the words say this, and now I've got to figure that part out.
I had a really positive experience, though, with the people in the community that had different biblical interpretations, because quite a few years ago, I realized that our students really had to have, in order to be biologists, a course in evolution. And there wasn't one at Southern. And I had some background in that area and courses, and so I designed and put a course together. But one of the biggest fears I had was the opposition from people whose biblical background didn't give them the laterality to accommodate Darwinian evolution like the Catholic religion does, as far as it fits into our theology. And so when I taught that class, there were even several students in there from OCC, Ozark Christian College.
Right. Uh-huh.
And I anticipated kind of an antagonistic relationship, and it was just the opposite. It was a really delightful interaction of people who really disagreed on, and primarily we didn't talk about science as much as we talked about biblical interpretation and
right.
ways of doing that. And I don't think I changed any of their minds, nor did they change my mind, except to appreciate differing thoughts. But what I really had some trepidation about that. I thought, man, this is going to be tough. And so I was really pleased with how they approached that.
Well, and I my own experience of teaching, at that level is pretty much the same way. I mean, it was just like I never tried to change a student's faith who came into my course. And that wasn't my purpose. And I was teaching world religions.
Oh yeah.
But I had to say, okay, so our purpose in here is not to judge which one of these is right or wrong, or to judge what the interpretation was, but to basically say, how does somebody else see reality?
Yeah.
How does somebody else look at this? How does somebody else interpret this? What's their take on it? So, like for example, Judaism, Christianity, Islam all believe in the oneness of God. And one of the questions always of my Muslim students was, then why do you talk about in terms of a Father, Son, and Spirit? And I knew we were going to have to go there because they really were trying to wrap their brains around it. But the same problem was when I was teaching folks about Hinduism and the way Hindu people saw the world. I mean, one of those questions I would say, is Hinduism polytheistic, meaning many gods, or monotheistic? And again, you're going to find Hindus who are going to describe it both ways, but most of the time they're going to describe it as one reality, but all these other things. So it's always interesting, again. One of the things I just kept trying to tell my students, we gotta step into somebody else's shoes, not because we're going to wear them forever. That's not the point. We don't want to wear, when we make a choice in faith, we're going to wear the shoes that we decide we're going to take on and do that. And I think that's a good thing, a good lesson in life. But how do I at least try them on so that I can see what the other person's looking at? Because most of the time, I mean, I would say, again, like your students and like some of my students, it's just, we're not trying to lead them away from that. In some ways, they feel more solid in what they believed in the first place, and that's okay. But belief is one thing, but what happens when we go to science? And do those two have to come into conflict with one another necessarily? Or are they asking different questions about the same thing, perhaps, but asking different questions and answering them in a different way?
Different scriptural interpretations will either make them be rather co-equal, or some of them will cause them to be specifically in conflict with each other.
And again, I think that's when you do comparative religions, because that's when you set them all side by side and let them all speak their own truths. And then whoever wants to label or define truth can go through and sort accordingly. Based upon what they really believe. But I will say, I don't know that anybody's ever been convinced or had their faith proven to them, because faith, I think, is a completely different animal when it comes down to that. So we're going to take a break here. This is Faith in Our Hometown. We're going to take a quick break, and we're going to be right back to finish our discussion with Jim and Paula on faith and reason. So don't go away.
You're watching Faith in Our Hometown on KSN TV, brought to you as a community service and sponsored by Mercy Hospital, Joplin.
Well, I hope that after half of this program you understand why we decided we needed a part 2, because obviously we were not nearly finished talking about all this stuff in terms of how these things interact with one another. Jim was just sharing before the break a little bit about, the fact that sometimes where we come from one perspective is naturally going to put us in a little bit of a conflict with somebody who's going to take a different perspective.
What I was really surprised about one time is I had a student come into my biology class and say, do I have to believe in evolution to pass this class? And I said, where did you get that idea? I mean, why do you think that? And he was just filled with such trepidation about who we were, I guess, and the evil aspects of science. I don't know where he got these ideas, but it's one of those things floating around, and that's obviously the least thing that we wanted to do.
But I mean, you've got. I think again, if you're gonna teach science then you teach science and what science tells us. From that. I think if you're going to teach faith, well, you teach faith, and you teach that from that perspective, and things usually will settle out and work well. Now, I don't see that those things come personally. I don't have those two things. Don't really cause much consternation in me. I mean, they just don't cause me a whole lot of anxiety. How some of those things all fit together, because I mean, it's kind of like the church. I mean, a lot of people don't know this, but the church established centers of learning, way back when, way back, because what we wanted to do was we wanted everybody to find the truth, and then we believed that when we found the truth, at the end of our searching, and when we found something we thought was really true, we were going to find God. And whether that was in, what we were going to learn in the sciences, so like, evolution is, and from my perspective, doesn't necessarily need to conflict with anthropology and those kinds of things. What I'm going to come up with when looking at a biblical record or a biblical story doesn't necessarily have to conflict history. I look for the corroborations that I can, but I look at it and go, the story of Abraham, as you brought up earlier, Paul, the story of Abraham is about God reaching into time and space and forming a relationship with people.
Right.
Okay. And that to me is the the whole thing. So whether or not there was an Abraham is not quite as important to me as the fact that God reached into time and space and formed a relationship with us. All right, and still calls us in some ways to be family. In terms of those things. Or, for example, 7 days of creation, whether those mean 7 epochs or whatever, however you want to interpret it. For me, that's a story about the fact that wherever it all comes from, it comes from God.
But one of those areas, while we're talking about areas that are in conflict with me, the preponderance of physiological and morphological and biological evidence now is that
those were not dirty words, by the way.
Sexual orientation is inherent and inscribed and not a choice in the individuals. And I'm not sure, I'm a bit uncomfortable with how my church, the Catholic Church, accommodates that in the individuals that are members. And I wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Okay, well, that's a whole different show, but I'll give you a quick answer.
Okay.
All right, but I mean, what I would say is that what we've discovered is the same thing that you're talking about, is the fact that right now nobody knows what where that comes from. Nobody knows what that's all about.
Okay.
It can be one origin, it can be several, but the whole thing is we really never figured it out yet. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
So what we basically say is people through no fault of their own wind up having sometimes this
different
orientation. And what we really say, and this is where we don't practice very well what we preach. Okay. But what we say is that those people should still be loved and respected, and and have a place of dignity and all those things among us. Now, when it comes to how a person chooses to behave, or how a person's going to live that out in terms of relationships with everything else, then we still got to interpret the whole thing of, okay, what does that mean in terms of can a person be in a relationship, and can that relationship be sexual, because obviously there's nothing wrong with good friendships, but what can that relationship be genital?
Yeah.
I guess it's sexual by its nature in terms of just male, female, how all that works. But I'm just saying, but in terms of, can there be a genital expression in that relationship? Well, that's when our other morality teachings kick in, and we would probably say, we don't see, and again, in our version of looking at natural law and order and some of those things, the bishops would say, no, we can't, we just don't see that we can just say, go do what you want. Because when do we tell anybody they can go do what they want anyway? I mean, that's just not who we are or what we do. But I mean, within that, so we'd say that seems to come into conflict with what we understand about how things seem to work biologically, et cetera, and we don't think that that God would be, that doesn't seem to be part of what we would interpret as God's plan.
Is this evidence of the church moving sort of with great inertia through geologic time, or is this a pretty steadfast phenomenon?
Well, again, I think the way we look at so many things and interpret them as people of faith is a combination of those things.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know that I don't know that I even have an answer to that, because do I think that the church moves through time and space and has to still grapple with what this means? And when we find out another piece of whatever we find out as people of reason, then okay, well, what does that mean to us as people of faith? It's just like, okay, so what if we did find out what caused it? All right?
Yeah.
Would we then try to cure it? Or would we then say that this is just a different expression of variety in the way that God does variety? And I don't have the answer to that, because right now nothing compelling enough has come along to make the church kind of change its direction or change its mind.
Yeah.
But I am going to say we don't do a very good job treating people with dignity, love, honor, and respect all the time. And that's the bigger problem.
Yeah.
Because we say it, but we don't practice it.
Yeah.
We don't practice that as well as we should.
But a wise man once said, it is deeply flawed, this church of ours, but it's the best we've got.
Well, I can't imagine who would say something like that,
right.
other than perhaps myself. But I mean, but that's where, again, I think that's part of what led me to study world religions.
Yeah.
Right.
Is I wanted to see what other people thought. I wanted to see how other people saw ultimate reality. I wanted to see how people described that.
Yeah.
And did that. And so, I mean, now, did it still lead me back to what I believe? Yeah. I mean, it's not that I just outright, rejected everything in those other traditions. I think there's some great wisdom in some of those other traditions. But do I think it's the fullness of the truth that I experience in my Catholicism and my Christianity? Well, obviously, no, or I'd do it, or I'd be it.
But you really can learn more from somebody who has different beliefs than
Oh my
you.
gosh!
Similar.
I mean, I often said to my students, you can't really understand Christianity unless you understand Judaism first.
That's right.
Because let's face it, I mean, the man was Jewish.
Yeah.
I mean, he wasn't. They were always shocked when I would say, "I'm gonna rattle your faith right now to the core. Jesus was not Catholic."
Yeah.
Okay, and they're like,
Yeah.
and I'm just saying he was Jewish.
Yeah.
And so you can't even understand that without doing that. But how many of us Christians out there are running around with such just a little piddly understanding of what the Jewish mindset was, and into which that milieu in which Jesus was born? I mean, we don't.
Yeah.
So it's just always amazing in that regard.
Yeah, and I would say there's a different challenge for Jews, because as we were talking about earlier, not too long into the Torah, we learned that God, for reasons that aren't self-evident, chooses a particular man and woman and says, I'm going to have a special relationship with your heirs. Well, what does that mean about God's relationship with the rest of humankind? And that's a tough question.
Yeah.
And of course, there was some say, well, they're the chosen people, the rest don't matter, at least until they reject their own religions. But I think there's other ways of looking at it. Part of it may be, and a book I've drawn on for this is by a distinguished British rabbi, Jonathan Sacks, called The Dignity of Difference. Says maybe the Tower of Babel story isn't a way of telling us how God punished people for being overly ambitious, but God wanted humankind to reach their fullest potential through diversity. We don't all speak one language, we're not all the same religion, we don't all share the same culture, and we're the richer for it to the extent that we can learn from each other. one of the sayings in the Mishnah, book of Jewish wisdom that began to be compiled about the time of Jesus, was, who is wise? He who can learn from everyone.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Even that whole business about, for those of us who do believe in one God, I mean, my question always is like, who doesn't belong to him then? I mean, really,
Exactly, yeah.
who doesn't belong to him then at that point in time? One of the, and I certainly have not studied all of the Talmud. I mean, it's a lifelong process, and but I love some of the pieces I've heard of it. And one of the old, Jewish teachers basically, when doing discourse on, for example, God freeing, the people of Israel from their slavery, and when the Red Sea then crashed over all the Egyptians and and wiped them out, so that Israel could go free. When they were singing their songs and making their proclamations about God has freed us from all this, this said perhaps one of the things that God said at that point in time was, how can you be rejoicing when my other children, the Egyptians, had now been killed?
Yeah.
Right.
So it's always, there's always something else to think about. And again, I know that's not in, scriptures, in anybody's scripture, but I love the fact that, sometimes, if we believe in one God, and we're holding that, how do we, who doesn't belong to him?
Yeah.
And so that's our whole dissident. Now, I'm going to tell you, this has been one of those fun shows that, again, I don't know where we wandered to or where we came from, but I love having the conversation, and I hope you've been enjoying it on a Sunday morning too. I hope this has made you reach for another cup of coffee, or has just made you go, or scratched your head at one point in time and gone, I don't know what's going on. But at any rate, don't go away. We're going to be right back up to wrap up right after this Mercy Minute. Jim and Paul, thank you for joining us this morning and being with us
You're
again.
very
It's been
welcome.
great.
It was a pleasure.
So stick around. We'll be right back to wrap up.
The SANE program, or Sexual Assault Nurse Examiner program, is a program established to provide a coordinated, specialized care to patients or women or men who've been the victim of sexual assault.
The SANE program is really designed to be a collaborative community response to sexual assault.
It's really important to make sure that it's not just the report or the forensic, but they get all of the testing that might be needed for their health.
It's also important to know that you don't need to know if you want to press charges or not. We don't get law enforcement involved unless you request it.
I just want to express to the victim that it is never your fault. You always have the right to say no, and that it's your body. So if you say yes one time, it doesn't mean every time.
I think it's important that sexual assault victims remember they've been victims of a crime, and crime victims do not pay for those services.
Well, again, thanks for joining us for another Sunday of conversation. My guest this morning, again, Dr. Paul Teverow, Dr. Jim Jackson. We kind of like weaved in and out of faith, reason, and what we believe, and the challenges to us as people of faith, challenges to our own traditions. And I think that bespeaks everybody's experience, no matter which tradition we hold. We sometimes come into conflict with our own tradition. Sometimes we wonder about some of the things that we hold or that we teach. Can we change them? Should we change them? How do we interpret the scriptures that guide them? How do we do all those things? How do we figure out where the truth is, both as people of faith, which we cling to and love, and as people of reason, because we also want to bring our best minds. If God gave us these minds, then we got to bring those to bear on the situations as well. At any rate, we hope you've all enjoyed the conversation this morning. Hope you have a great Sunday and a great week. Join us again next week for Faith in Our Hometown.
Thanks for watching. Faith in Our Hometown can be seen Sunday mornings at 6:30 and 9 a.m. on KSN. Brought to you as a community service and sponsored by Mercy Hospital, Joplin.